welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, you join us on another of our influencers episodes. And Chris, you are the lead on this one. Who are we doing?
Well, before we start, and to annoy people, I declare officially this to be our DEI month on battling with business.
Controversial.
Well, you witness an angry Chris Kitchener because as we speak in the US particularly, there's been lots and lots of recent discussion with Donald Trump and his administration about the evils of DEI. When we're recording this, it wasn't that long ago that there was a terrible aviation accident in Washington, D.C. And before anyone knew what the cause was, Donald Trump had surmised that this was probably due to the fact that there had been DEI hires, and therefore probably that was the reason why people died. And as people who have listened to this before, we try not to be overly political. And I was angry, not politically because of that. I was angry because we ourselves, particularly in the influencers, but all of our conversations have talked about the fact that while some people might think that DEI is a weakness, we think it's a strength. We think we're better, we're faster, we're stronger. And it's that diversity in whatever your definition of diversity is that brings it to you. So as I'd written these notes actually a couple of weeks ago, again, we're letting you into secrets, we write notes and then we hold on to them until we can come together and record these. And I was sort of thinking about this particular person. There's a very exciting story, but I was trying to work out what the hook I could put this story on. And Mr. Trump helped me. And hence I'm declaring this to be DEI month for battling with business. And we've got this particular person, and I'm very excited because in a couple of weeks, we're going to be recording another influencer and a little bit of a sort of a teaser ahead. For the first time, we have someone who really knows about the influencer because they've written the book about them. And that is another example of this. Sorry, I stopped you. You were going to say something, but I had to get my DEI rant out.
I was only going to agree with you. I was going to say that we have talked quite a lot about the value of diversity, but I think what we haven't talked about is equity and inclusion. And from my perspective, it's very, very simple. Diversity comes with the challenge of having to manage, lead lots of different ideas, lots of different backgrounds, lots of different perspectives. And we've talked, many times about why that challenge is worth it. And actually what you don't want is, autonomous. You don't want, lots and lots of replications of the same thing because unless you are trying to be very, very precise in a very controlled circumstance, you need to be dynamic, you need to be agile, you need to change with the environment. So we've kind of done that a lot. What we haven't talked about is equity and inclusion. And I think, for me, it's just good old-fashioned leadership that you manage both the organization that has its objectives, has its strategic goals, but you manage the people within that. And so, it's just common sense that you need to take into account other people's requirements to be included. And it's really simple, really simple.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that sort of, sorry, this is a brief side rant that we're having on this. People who talk about it in terms of woke and DEI, this is about merit. This is truly, truly about merit. By the way, again, as another side thing, I saw something on television the other day that made me guffaw, and it was Donald Trump's daughter standing up in front of the RNC declaring that DEI is bad and people should only be hired on merit. And it was pointed out, said the daughter of the president of the United States who had been put into that position because, she was his daughter. Anyway, I think it is about winning. Forget any of the namby-pamby liberal stuff you might imagine. When I go to war, I want a diverse team because we will beat the opposition. And coming back to what the question you asked about 5 minutes ago, who are we talking about? Today, we're talking about Amelia Mary Earhart. And why I love this story is because we are often told women are weak, women are not able. In fact, it's usually dressed up in fake politeness. Well, obviously, women can do many things, but there are just some things they can't do because they're not built that way. And you think, well, hang on a minute though, but there are short and weak men. I don't hear you saying that about short and weak men. Anyway, Amelia Earhart, we're going to talk about today. Gareth, what do you know about Amelia Earhart?
Not a great deal, actually. So I know that she was an aviator
She was an aviator.
who
Tricks, I guess the title is.
maybe, but she broke down a lot of barriers in terms of in a very male-dominated age. She did things that were unusual for a woman to do in terms of breaking first in the aviation world at a time where that wasn't expected. But beyond that, I don't know a huge amount.
So I didn't know an awful lot, and I think I wonder whether there's an element of, so I'm in my 50s now. When I was younger, you heard a bit more. And I wonder year on year, you learn and know less and less about her. At a very high level, it's kind of a forgotten story of a woman who died before she was 40. So she had not achieved everything she was going to achieve. As you rightly said, it's a story of firsts. There's a lot of firsts, and actually, we'll come on to what I think she's most known for in a second. And that was her attempted round the world trip, the first female circumnavigation of the planet, and she died. She went missing. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there were lots of other firsts, and it's quite interesting and quite understandable. I don't think anyone could name the other first that she'd done. We'll talk through some of those. The point being here is, I think she truly is one of those influencers, as in she had a massive impact on the world that echoes through today. And so I went back and I looked at some stories that the first all-female United States Air Force transatlantic flight happened only in 1983, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it, but that was a big first, and it was reported on because it's an all-women crew. Frontier Airlines had its first all-female flight in 1984. So these firsts, which at the time we reported, whereas now I don't think anyone blinks if it's an all-female crew. In fact, nobody even looks or cares. You can actually literally trace it back to Amelia Earhart in terms of what she did and how she did it. And if we have any feminists listening, I might get in trouble for what I'm going to say next, which is I think she was an accidental feminist. And I have to be very clear what I mean. Actually, she was a very clear feminist. And we'll talk about how she was very thoughtful and conscious about talking about women's roles, women's positions, and the challenges and the opportunities. But the reason why I say accidental is she was busy doing these things rather than theoretically saying, well, if only people were nicer to us. She literally did these things. So courageous trailblazer, and we're going to talk a bit about courage, I think, women's rights champion, and a trendsetter. And I've tried to sort of balance this. One of the challenges I always find when we do these influencers is that it becomes the story of them rather than their story. And as in, we don't get to hear their voices. And I think this is one where for some of the people we've talked about, you could almost hear their voice in your head. I remember Rommel, we could almost imagine what Rommel or Churchill might say in any situation. With Amelia Earhart, I didn't get that. I don't know what she was really like in real life. But actually, the story is really interesting. The results are very clear and an amazing story. Maybe it's not as simple as saying she did this, this, and this, and we could learn from it, but we'll see as we'll go through. So,
Cool.
Amelia Earhart, born July 1897. It's a bit of a clue why we maybe don't know much about her. She was born in Kansas and relatively modest upbringing. Her father was a railroad man. And so there was lots of traveling with the family. So she wasn't sort of the person that grew up in one little town and stayed there. And very, very early in her life, you could start to see what kind of a woman she was going to be. And by the way, as we've discussed on many episodes, I'm thinly read. I've actually read one of her books. She wrote three books in the end. And so it's lovely to hear her voice in that book. So you get some of these. As a child, she spent hours playing with her sister, doing things that today we would describe as tomboy activities. In fact, maybe today we wouldn't even particularly blink. Quote, I loved school, although I was never a teacher's pet. Unfortunately, I lived at a time when girls were girls. I love that. She's already aware there's this perception of how girls should behave. And she said, it's a real shame. I'm not one of those. I do something different. She climbed trees, she hunted rats with rifles, and she went sledding. Early memories of family and friends is she wore gym suits to play rather than dresses, which, let's be clear, back in the early 1900s, girls wore dresses, pretty dresses. That's what they did. She's like, no, I don't. I'm wearing a gym suit. She really was a daredevil, and it didn't matter whether she was a boy or a girl. At the age of 7, with the help of her uncle, she constructed, I love this. I can almost see you doing this as well, Gareth. In fact, I bet you're going to tell me a story of this. She constructed a homemade ramp that was fashioned as if it were a roller coaster and secured it to the roof of the family tool shed and got on her cart, flew across, and emerged from a broken wooden box with a bruised lip, torn dress, and, quote, a sense of exhilaration, saying to her sister, oh, Pidge, it's just like flying. Which, if you think about it, that was before the Wright brothers. She's already starting to think ahead. But you can tell this is not a girl who takes prisoners. How many girls do you know strap ramps to the top of the house and then slide off it and get all very excited about it? I love that.
Yeah, I know as a kid I built myself a parachute out of sellotape and paper, and then
How did it end?
I climbed to the top of my climbing frame with a chair and a table, and I stacked the table on top of the climbing frame and the chair on top of that, and then I jumped off. Um, and it ended in a sort of similar fashion. I think I got
Poorly?
a grazed knee, a sense of exhilaration. But I don't think the parachute worked. But yeah, no, it's really interesting, isn't it? That you at such a young age, she's already clearly indicating where she wants to go.
And actually, your story was great. You could have interchanged that. You could have gone off on a sled, and she could have climbed off and jumped on a parachute. There's no difference here. There's no, well, she's a girl, so that's good. She saw her first aircraft at the Iowa State Fair in Des Moines. And her father said, would you like to go for a flight, girl? She had a sister. And Amelia promptly asked if they could go back to the merry-go-round. And she later described the biplane as, quote, a thing of rusty wire and wood and not at all interesting. So, flying had its
Ah,
chance and then flying failed. Flying did not get her excited. So it wasn't all plain sailing to get to where she goes to. So she graduates from school in 1916. And pop quiz, Gareth, what is going on in 1916?
the First World War.
First World War. And not only is the First World War going on, but she was known as she grew up thinking about her future career, and she kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about successful women in male-dominated careers. So she was thinking about people in film direction, production, law, advertising, mechanical engineering. These were her heroes, women who were already showing they could do just as well as the men. However, in 1917, having seen soldiers returning from World War One, she starts to show her practical nature. She says, I'm going to train as a nurse with the Red Cross. And she actually went to Toronto. So she moved from America to Toronto and worked with a voluntary aid detachment at a military hospital in Toronto. At that point, you're thinking, why are you telling me that she's becoming a nurse? Because guess who she starts to talk to in those hospitals? She starts to talk to military pilots. And all of a
Ah.
sudden, they're piquing her interest. And while she start continuing with her medical studies, you can see that there's this sort of interest in flying is rekindled from the initial rusty string, don't like that kind of thing. Interestingly, as she's doing her studies, she has a very painful illness related to her sinus. And actually, she has to have surgery on her sinus. And later in life, that actually had a really big impact on her flying. I believe, I don't know whether I read this correctly, she actually had a tube which she used to drain her sinuses. And later on in life, there are more operations that she has. So there were this was not easy. This was not someone who had everything going for it. It was all placed on a plate. There were hardships. And I think this whole practical driving to succeed, I'm going to do the thing that I think is right. Big thing for her. Roll on a few years later, 1920, Earhart and one of her friends visit an airfair in Toronto as part of the Canadian National Exhibition. And she said, quote, the interest aroused in me in Toronto led me to all the air circuses in the vicinity. So through the war and after the war, when particularly there were lots of trained pilots and cheap aeroplanes, flying circuses were a huge thing where literally a guy and whoever else, one or two other people in an aeroplane would fly from town to town and they would do what was called barnstorming, where they would do a display and they would give people flights. This is another air circus, and she's starting to get excited. And for her, one of the highlights of the day on that day in Toronto was a flying exhibition put on by a World War One ace. And the pilot saw Earhart and her friend watching from an isolated clearing, and what every self-respecting male pilot would do says, young ladies, I will dive my aeroplane at them. And she said in her book, I'm sure he said to himself, watch we make them scamper, she said. But of course, she stood her ground, and she stood and she stared. She said, I didn't understand at the time, but I believe that little red aeroplane said something to me as it swished by. Okay, this is a person who is not going to be distracted, who is not going to be made afraid of stuff. I love that. And even just the term as it swished by, I thought that was fantastic. Roll on later in the year, her and her father go to an aerial meet. It's another of these sort of get-togethers in Long Beach, California. And she asked her father to ask about passenger flights and flying lessons. So she is now 23. She was booked in for a passenger flight the following day. 10-minute flight that cost $10. And that was the flight that changed her life.
It seems to me one of the things we've sort of glossed over but kind of alluded to is the fact that she's quite unusual for a woman of her time to be not only interested in the pursuits of, adventure and things that are perhaps traditionally sort of assumed to be interests that boys would have, but her parents haven't discouraged her. It,
No,
it
quite.
seems like her father is always present and he's part of the encouraging her to, yeah, or at least not discouraging her from
I'm
exploring these things.
fascinating. How much was it he said, I want you to go and do this? And how much of it was, well, we can't bloody stop her. We might as well support her. Interesting question. But you're absolutely right. I wonder whether there's also, this is an opportunity to talk about the bell curve of life, which says in any population alive today, there is a bell curve of people. And on the edges, where the bell curve is relatively flat, so there's not many of them, there are these people that say, irrespective of what the norm is today, I'm going to buck those trends or I'm going to believe I can change something. And so yes, 90% of the female population might say there is no opportunity. I kind of followed the path that has been set for me, whether I agree for it or not. She was one on the bell curve that said, no, I
Yeah.
can do anything I want. And the bell curve, that piece of the bell curve is the most powerful piece of the bell curve because then 60 years later, 65 years later, there are all female crews on commercial airliners. 100 years later, nobody even blinks about women doing things. You can literally trace that from Amelia Earhart and a number of her friends to get there. So that's the power of influencing. That's the power to change these things as well. Don't necessarily listen to the orthodoxy, have the guts to make a change. And this is kind of interesting. There's a dichotomy as we go through Amelia's story and she stands up for women's rights. How much of this is she's doing the things for women's rights, and how much of this is she's doing the things that she would naturally do, and that's good for women's rights. That's why I sort of said at the beginning, an accidental feminist, where I think even if she wasn't a feminist, she'd still be doing all of these same things. It's just she wouldn't necessarily have a vision of what that could lead to and why that's so important.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? The word, we started this whole podcast talking about Donald Trump sort of outbursts against DEI, and you sometimes hear similar kind of myopic outbursts against feminism. And of course, these are loaded terms that have different meanings to different people. And at one extreme, you do have a very, very small minority of people that describe themselves as feminists who are, objectionable in that they're, this very, very small minority who have a very particular view of what feminism is. But of course, for most of us, feminism is simply the promotion of, you know, the equality and inclusion of, you know, women,
Which,
women in
which is
society.
which is merit based, going back to that
Which
point I
is,
made.
yeah, absolutely. And so, I think if you want to be, myopic in your, particular definitions, you could argue that, Amelia Earhart is a feminist or isn't a feminist. Is promoting women's opportunities, not because that's her goal, but by dint of the fact that she's doing new things. I would call that feminism. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I'm kind of spoiling it for myself because later on she very carefully talks about this. And a lot of the things she does, she explicitly calls out. Part of the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to advance the opportunities for women because I think that's important. So
Yeah.
she's done her first 10-minute flight, and she says, as soon as I left the ground, I knew I had to fly. Miles away, I saw the ocean and the Hollywood Hills seemed to peep over the edge of the cockpit as if they were already friends. I I think there's something about flying that is romantic. And even some of our most grizzled aviation friends, who we know very well, and some of which dress very nicely as vicars in fancy dress costumes, I think they are just as romantic. So
Are we going to explain that, or are we just going to move on?
I think we should move on. I think the idea that there are aviators in this world that like dressing up as vicars is all we need to say for the moment. If ever you meet us in person, do ask us. There is a plausible and not weird reason, but we're just not going to give it to you because we want to build narrative tension and clickbait. We'll probably get called out and it'll be in the press and website somewhere. Anyway, so she's decided she wants to learn to fly. Gareth,
Yes.
talk to me in 1920 about what is needed in terms of compliance and regulation to fly.
1920, a very natty leather jacket and a pair of goggles.
You are entirely correct. So no licenses. Forget that. If you can survive, you win. She starts to learn to fly with a lady called Netta Snook. And this is this woman's interesting in her own right because she is a pioneer aviator who also has a long list of firsts, but you can see like-minded people connect and help each other. So Netta was the first woman aviator in Iowa, first woman student accepted at the Curtis Flying School in Virginia, the first woman aviator to run her own business, and the first woman to run a commercial airfield. And so,
Awesome.
you can, yeah, this isn't about poor women. If only we could have diversity and inclusion. This is women going, I'm going to run my own airfield. There's a fantastic quote as she talks about learning to fly, and Amelia says, "Trouble in the air is very rare. It's hitting the ground that causes it." That is an old joke. Glad to see it goes back as far as 1920. She said, "Perhaps the greatest joy of flying is the magnificence of the view. If visibility is good, the passenger seems to see the whole world. Colors stand out, and the shades of earth, unseen from below, form an endless magic carpet." I love that. 12 hours of instruction cost $500. I'm sure I should have worked out what that is in modern amounts, but I suspect it's quite a lot. To pay for this, Amelia worked as a photographer, a truck driver, a stenographer, and she saved $1,000 to get her flying lessons. And on January the 3rd, 1921, in a crash salvaged aircraft, a Curtis Jenny, I think it was a JN4, she had her first flying lesson. To reach the airfield, she had to take a bus and then walk for 4 miles. This is a woman who wanted to fly. This is a woman who was going to fly. And you asked about her parents. Earhart's mother provided part of the $1,000, quote, against her better judgment. And I urge you, I think with all these influences, is go Google Amelia Earhart and look for some pictures. There's not a huge number of photos and there's a few videos, but go look for her. She has a very distinctive look. She has cropped short hair, which was very much in the style of other female flyers. And perhaps an interesting thing about people building narrative, she was defining her tribe. She wasn't the sort of, I go around in a dress and it's all pretty and all that kind of stuff. This was her look. Again, it's always difficult to know. Did she say, I have to look the part, or did she say, well, I'm an aviator and we have short hair so things don't get caught up? Very interesting. 6 months later, she's done her flying lessons, and apparently, against her instructor's advice, she purchases a second-hand chromium yellow Kinner Airster biplane, which she nicknames the Carrari at the Canary, just to give you a sense of what she was learning to fly. Because again, you sort of go flying. Okay, learning to fly and flying, you have to have guts. This was a biplane. Gareth, do you know what horsepower your car has got?
I do, yes. My car is a V8, 5 litre V8, and it has 450
So
horses.
that's for you to roll along a road. Uh,
Yep.
Her biplane had 60 horsepower.
I mean, my car is perhaps slightly overpowered and doesn't need 450,
I would
but
argue hers is slightly underpowered, and it had
yes,
a maximum speed of 74 knots, 85 miles an hour. This wasn't a production aircraft that she bought. This was the second ever version of the aircraft built. The first one, the prototype, crashed. So
excellent.
this is a pretty gutsy move that even, I'm an aviator, I know how to fly. Maybe someone else could fly that particular airplane.
I
Um,
think that says something about you know her
passion, drive.
yeah,
Um,
and an attitude to risk in relation to what she wants to achieve. And yeah, that's a very unique thing. So irrespective of the time, irrespective of gender, you know, the type of person that says, I want to do this so much that objectively, when looking at the risk, I am willing to get into the second version of something that is objectively dangerous when the first version catastrophically failed. Yeah, that's an unusual person.
yeah,
That would be unusual today.
I love it. you can see each one of these things drives her forward to
Yeah.
something new. After a first successful solo landing on with her aeroplane, she bought a new leather flying coat, which she was then teased about because it was new. So she slept in it and stained it with aircraft oil. My kind of girl. Yeah, I'm gonna make it better. She so this is in 1921. In October 1922, she takes her aeroplane to a dizzying altitude of 14,000 feet, setting her first world record. That is a world record height for female pilots. And by the way, typically at 10,000 feet, the air starts to get very thin. And so typically you don't go above 10,000 feet without starting to think about oxygen. So again, this was dangerous and this was a thing. On May the 16th, 1923, obviously they're starting to develop in America how they think about flying. Earhart became the 16th woman in the United States to be issued a pilot's license. The 16th
Wow.
woman. She was 25. Just for all of us out there that say, what did you manage by the age of 25? We're all losers because I bet we didn't manage most of that. How many of us had altitude records at the age of 25? Starts to get a bit trickier for her now. Money's run out and she's struggling to work out what she wants to do. She sells her biplane, replaces it with a car. She likes speed and danger. And she's driving her mother around Western United States. Probably was going to go to Columbia University and MIT, but then her parents divorce and her mother can't support her. But she kind of knew that she wanted to do something with flying. She moves to Massachusetts, maintains an interest in aviation, and she becomes a member of the American Aeronautical Society's chapter in Boston. And then, unsurprisingly, because this is Amelia Earhart, she's elected vice president. When she flies out of a place called Denison Airport, and as she flies and as she earns money, she helps finance the airport's operation. So she's investing a small amount of money in an airport, and actually she flies the first official flight out of the airport. Obviously, it was a grass strip, and then they'd make it into an airport. And she actually then becomes a sales representative for Kinner Aircraft, which obviously was the aircraft she bought, and started to write local newspaper columns. And so now you can start to see this image of Earhart that perhaps you might be a little bit more familiar with. She's talking about flying. She's writing newspaper columns. She's now becoming a bit of a celebrity. She's the person that works for this company selling aircraft. She's engaged in, she owns part of an airfield, and she's now making plans to launch an organization for female flyers. Interesting question is how much she actually liked the limelight. And in a minute, we're
Hmm.
going to hear her talk. And as I see her talk and as I read her book, I kind of get the feeling there are influencers who love the limelight. We keep talking about Rommel, but I don't know whether you remember, Rommel was the guy who, when they invaded France, there was a film crew and he insisted they film him crossing a bridge a second time because it looked better. And so
Yeah.
these are the kinds of people who love the limelight. Don't know that she really loved the limelight. I think she recognized it was important to participate to be able to get her message out. So that was interesting. Okay, we're halfway through. We've warmed up to the point where now all of a sudden we know why she likes flying, what she's doing. Let's take a very quick break, and then we come back. Let's start talking about some of the records she's famous for and how she gets to the point where she's doing a round the world trip.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
See you in a second. Welcome back. Before we left, we had talked about this funny looking character with short hair and an oily leather jacket who had one day been on a 10-minute flight, and the next thing you know, flying is in her blood and breaking records is in her blood and demonstrating that women can do, frankly, anything that men can do. That's where we were. We're now in 1928, and Earhart receives a call from a Captain H. Riley, who asks her if she, quote, might be interested in doing something for aviation which might be hazardous. I love this. Now, I think Riley, or Rayleigh, sorry, I said Riley, it was Rayleigh, is an American, but you do have to imagine a British accent. Would you be interested in doing something for aviation which might be hazardous, my dear? And the hazardous thing was the to become the first woman to cross the Atlantic in an aeroplane.
Yeah. And remind us at this point how many people have already crossed the Atlantic in an aeroplane.
It is a very small number of people. I think I've got the notes. I think it's like 6 or 7 people. It's not many. Alcock and Brown were the first people to cross the Atlantic.
Yeah.
I don't think Lindbergh had done it yet solo. This was still super new. So in 1928, she became the first woman to cross the Atlantic. Now, you might imagine, Gareth, this is the first woman to cross the Atlantic. She is a pilot. She is an expert pilot. So obviously, star billing, she's going to fly the aeroplane. Yeah, no, she's not going to fly the aeroplane. But we'll come on to that in a second. Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Well, you can guess what's going to happen. We'll come on to that in a second. There's a nice ending to it, but you can imagine what happened. Anyway, interestingly, this expedition, well, you might ask why Earhart was even asked. That is because Mrs. Frederick Guest financed the trip, and she said, "I'm going to finance a trip where the first woman is going to cross the Atlantic." And it's like, oh, better find a bloody woman to do that. And Frederick Mrs. Guest said, more than ever did I realize how essential this was a feminine expedition originated and financed by a woman whose wish was to emphasize that what her sex stood ready to do. Again, it's a group of people. Maybe there's a lesson in there for us, which is find your tribe, and together as a tribe, you can start to make these changes. Without Mrs. Guest, this trip wouldn't have happened, and the next things maybe wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
So, as we said, I've kind of spoiled it. You'd imagine that she was the pilot? No. Co-pilot? No. She was just a passenger. The plane was flown by Wilma Stultz and co-pilot mechanic Louis Gordon. Actually, I knew I'd written some better notes. You said how many times this happened? This was the 8th crossing of the Atlantic, and she would be one of only 30 people to cross the Atlantic at this time.
Wow.
The aircraft was a Fokker trimotor, so it's got 3 engines, and it was called Friendship, and it had floats attached to it, and it was still dodgy. Because if you
Yeah.
think about it in terms of how you navigate reliability of engines, this is all a bit of a problem. The pilot received $20,000 for this flight, which back then was a large sum of money. The mechanic was paid $5,000, and Amelia was paid
Less.
nothing.
Nothing. Wow.
Nothing. Because you know what? You're just a passenger and you're a girl. We're not going to pay you. Doesn't matter though, because that actually, it turns out she did really well out of it. June 17th, 1928, they leave from Newfoundland and they arrive in very glamorous Berry Port in South Wales 20 hours and 40 minutes later. All of those people who have been in economy and complained about a transatlantic flight, wind your necks in. That was easy compared to this. To be fair, she didn't have training on that aircraft, and so she didn't fly the plane. And when interviewed after landing, she said, Stultz did all the flying, had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. And she said, maybe one day I'll try it alone. Spoiler alert, she tries it alone. Interestingly, and unsurprisingly, and in beautiful reverse sexism, she was the one that gained the international attention and the press greeted her like a heroine. So in a funny way, they were like, we don't want to speak to the pilot and mechanic. We want to speak to you because, of course, it was a novelty.
Yeah. Which is strange, isn't it? Because that is both, like you say, a reverse of the prejudice that we've seen up until this point of, she's not going to fly and and also a reinforcement of the prejudice.
You'll get it later. I mean, I've got a bit of a film from the time. And it is classically sexist in terms of they didn't do it because they were being generous. They were doing it because there's a bit of a giggle and she's a
Yeah.
girl and we can laugh. Anyway, she flies to Southampton from Wales, and an Irish aviator gives her an aircraft, Lady Mary Heath. And Lady Mary Heath, is the first woman to hold a commercial flying license in Britain. And actually that becomes her aircraft. So she flies, she ships that back to the US. So again, it's this network of connections and like-minded people that help pushing her career along, and people keep pushing along. 6th of July, she gets back to the States. President Calvin Coolidge receives her at the White House. And as a final point about that first transatlantic flight, the memorial in Wales mentions Amelia Earhart first, the pilot and engineer second. So in your face, men, in your face. Probably not fair, but in your face.
Yeah.
She's now becoming really famous. Now all of a sudden people want to talk about her. She's known as Lady Lindy because of her resemblance to Charles Lindbergh, and everyone knows who Charles Lindbergh is. She does a lecture tour. She starts to endorse media products, which is really interesting. There's a real sense of celebrity, earning money, but also furthering her cause. You'll be pleased to know she advertises luggage and Lucky Strike cigarettes. So there you go. Buy my cigarettes. They're very good. Um,
Healthy for you.
yeah. So there's a marketing campaign that a chap called Putnam, who is her publisher and lectures tour sponsor, which I think he's the founder of Putnam Books. I think so, famous book publishing. And because of this work, and there's a publisher and a PR person, all of a sudden we're starting to build this Earhart mystique in the public psyche. And rather than simply endorsing the products, she gets involved. So in women's fashions, the active living lines that were part of hers were sold in stores, and that in itself, she wore those, and that was an expression of her new image.
And
Um,
do we know if this was for financial gain,
it,
exploiting the newfound fame, or whether this was part of her deliberately building a narrative,
I
to
think it's
building a brand as part of her trying to advance
I
what
think it's
she can
both.
do?
It's
Okay,
it's absolutely both. So first of it is flying isn't cheap, and so it's funding the flying, but it's
sure.
absolutely that. Here's the next thing. So she enters a phase where she's Amy, actively promoting aviation and women in aviation. She now becomes an associate editor at Cosmopolitan magazine. I love this.
Interesting. Interesting.
Nobody knows this stuff anymore. It's like she was a flyer, she got lost. She did this. In her book, this is great. I think if you had her at the dinner table, you invited her as a dinner party guest, I think she would actually be quite quiet. And it's only when you engage her in things that she's passionate about, all of a sudden her eyes would light up and she'd start talking. I don't get the sense she's the in your face person, but she's really, really prescient. In fact, there's a whole bit I'm going to talk about a bit later, which is like, frankly, she's a seer in terms of what she knows. In her book, she says, "Someday, I dare say, women can be flyers and not regarded as curiosities." That's her goal.
Hmm.
I don't want to be special. I don't want to be more than anything else. Why would be anything more than curiosities? And she campaigns for a greater public acceptance of aviation and particularly women. And this is really important. I mean, it sounds weird, a greater public acceptance of aviation. People think flying is weird. People think flying is dangerous, and she's trying to convince them it's not dangerous or bad at all. And in 1929, Transcontinental Air Transport, an airline, they appoint her to promote air travel, but particularly for women. She is there directly to communicate with women and saying air travel is safe. This is how it works. And she actually helped set up an airline, Luddington, a first regional shuttle service between New York and Washington, D.C. So she's starting to not just talk about it, but she's working in the airline industry. So she's a real trailblazer,
Yeah.
not just for herself, but you can see for others. So she loves flying. And so in between all of these things she's flying, Gareth, do you know what an autogyro is?
Yes, I do.
Go on, you have to explain it now. If you'd have
So,
said no, I'd have let you off.
so an autogyro is it's a little bit like a helicopter in that it's got a rotor blade on the top, but that
Yep.
is an unpowered
Yes,
rotor blade, and the only powered element of it is forward propulsion, normally with a rear propeller pushing rather than a forward propeller pulling. And the forward momentum provides the lift to the blades of your overhead rotor,
exactly. But
giving it giving the overall craft lift. They have to be super light to work. I think the most famous one is the one
yes,
that James Bond uses
which is called,
in.
which is called.
I have no idea what it's called.
So the auto gyro is called Little Nelly. So if anyone wants to know what an auto gyro is, go Google Little Nelly and you will see Little Nelly. And ooh, it
From Russia with
was
Love?
it was from Russia with Love, and it's got rockets on and everything.
That's
You're
the
right.
one. It's
So
yellow. Yes.
the rotors that you have described in effect act as a wing and generate lift. Anyway, right now, if you said to me today, would you like to fly an auto gyro? I would say no, thank you very much. That seems very dangerous to me. Actually, they're not. One of the benefits, by the way, is if you're flying in an auto gyro and the engine stops, the rotor continues to spin around like a sycamore leaf and you can land. And you can also
You
do very clever things where you
effectively a gliding helicopter at that point.
effectively a
Yeah.
gliding helicopter. So anyway, she flies auto gyros because, of
Of
course, she
course.
flies auto gyros, and she flies to 18,000 feet without oxygen, which is rather dodgy. That's not, but
Yeah.
there you go. I'm just going to fly an auto gyro to 18,000 feet. She continues to think about this difference between men and women, and she writes a chapter in her book in 1932 called The Fun of It, talking about how men and women are treated differently. There are no scheduled women pilots. Most women in aviation are in factories or offices. And she says, quote, most girls are not able to earn as much as boys, yet they must pay the same price for flying lessons. I love that. If you want our definition of DEI, it is equal playing field. You know,
Yeah.
you want to talk about why people other aren't as good as you and don't have merit. Well, let's talk about why you have got privilege. Actually, in the same principle says you shouldn't be allowed to do that. So she's really, really thoughtful about this, and she talks about the fact. And she gets the point where she's a quarter of her book is about women's records that they've broken as flyers. So it is no accident. You know, I keep saying she's an accidental feminist. She's not an accidental feminist. She really understands. And actually, she's really able to talk. And as I was reading through the book, it was fascinating to see all these examples that make it very clear. This is not about someone being nice to women or giving them a leg up. This was women doing it for themselves. Loved it.
Nice.
Back to record breaking. 1928, she's the first woman to fly solo across the North American continent and then back. General Lee Wade, who I think became famous later, I've forgotten why. Anyway, oh yes, I know why. He was the first man to fly around the world in 1924.
Right.
And he said of Earhart, she was a born flyer with a delicate touch on the stick. One pilot to another. I salute her. I thought it was lovely. She gets into air racing. She also starts an organization for female pilots called the 99s. And it's about moral support and advancing the cause of women in aviation. She calls a meeting, and the name is because of the number of members who turn up to the meeting, the 99ers. I love that. That's good.
Nice.
She marries George Putnam. Remember Mr. Putnam, who was good about building her, helping her to build a narrative?
Yeah.
I love the detail. The detail in her book talks about how she got married in Putnam's mother's house in Connecticut, but it was described as a marriage of convenience. And she'd previously been engaged to a chemical engineer from Boston, broke that off in 1928, but she gets married to Putnam. And here is a beautiful little, every time you think you know someone, you have to remind yourself we're all human beings and we're all a little bit different. So on the wedding day, she hand delivers a note to Putnam where she writes, I want you to understand, I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. I may have to keep
Hmm.
some place where I can go to be by myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all times the confinement of even an attractive cage. When I read that, it blew my mind. Uh, she had an open marriage. It's very
Yeah.
clear that's what she's going to do. Oh, okay. You know what? There's inequality as well. And by the way, she kept her own name rather than being
Was
referred to Mrs. Putnam as well. So you could see that was a thing for her as well.
was she within the, norms of the time? Was she relatively open about that? Was that letter public, or was this something that was very intimate between them? Because
I
at the
think I think
time, that's
I
quite
don't think
a
it was particularly hidden. I mean, I don't remember her writing that in a book, but I think it was written in an article where she had clearly communicated this to someone. So it's not clear that she hid it. It's not clear that someone found out and leaked this. I kind of, as I read about her, I kind of get the feeling that that's just an incredibly pragmatic thing for her to say. I really like
yeah,
you. I want to be with you. I love you. But by the way I'm wired, that might not always be the case, but that doesn't diminish. Okay.
yeah. And
You know,
I think you're right.
nice.
It sort of indicates a pragmatism and a sort of an approach to life. But I think also interesting, given the time, it also if it's not publicly talked about, but it's not a closed secret, it gives an indication that she also doesn't really mind too much what other people think. What she cares about is her freedom to do what she wants to
I
do.
think, and again, part of this is about the story of Amelia Earhart, and part of this is about influencers and what makes them special.
Yeah,
That is a thing which is it's about what I want rather than my image, and I'm willing to say it, and it's that is a genuineness. There you go.
yeah.
Amelia Earhart seems genuine. Okay, we're coming towards the end of her story. She's 34 and she doesn't make it to 40. But the next thing she does is we've already heard. She says one day, maybe I'm going to cross the Atlantic on my own. And she intended to fly to Paris to copy Charles Lindbergh's flight, which had been in 1927, I think. And she sets off from Newfoundland. I love this, with a copy of the Telegraph Journal given to her by a journalist to confirm the date of the flight, because that's what you had to do. Okay, what we're going to do, I hope this will work. We'll see if this works. There is some footage and some video of what happened when she lands. Let's see if this works.
The end of the long, long trail that brought immortal fame to the first woman to fly alone across the Atlantic. After her 13-hour trip from Harbor Grace, Miss Earhart's greeted by a pouring rain. That's gratitude. But she's on her way to the American Embassy, where she spends a little time with Ambassador Mellon, all dressed up in some clothes borrowed from Mrs. David Bruce, daughter of Mr. Mellon. You see, all that Amelia took across was $20 and a bottle of tomato juice. And if you don't think she's raring to go shopping, you just watch her leave number 14 Prince's Gate, bound for London's biggest shops. Miss Earhart made a great personal hit over there. They recognized the magnitude of her triple achievement, broke all transatlantic records, first woman to fly alone, and the first person to fly across the ocean twice. And the whole world shares America's pride in the First Lady of the Air.
I love that. They could not resist talking about the fact she was desperate to go shopping. And
Yeah.
I almost wonder whether when they recorded that and he did the voiceover, he was ashamed of himself. It's like, this is the first woman to cross the Atlantic solo. This is the first woman to cross the Atlantic twice. Let's talk about her going shopping.
Yeah.
Maybe the press hasn't changed. 14 hours and 56 minutes. Strong northerly winds, icy conditions, and mechanical problems. She arrived in Derry. She received the Distinguished Flying Cross from Congress, the Cross of Knight of the Legion of Honor from the French government, the Gold Medal of the National Geographic Society from President Herbert Hoover. And you can see, okay, she is now megastar. Everyone knows this woman. You know, that film was a really good example. She becomes friendly with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and she takes her flying. It's almost step by step, she's building her ability to do things and change things along the way.
Yeah.
She doesn't stop. 1935, so 3 years later, the first aviator to fly solo from Honolulu to Oakland, California. Solo from Los Angeles to Mexico City to New York, each of which had never been done solo by a woman. And her love of autogyros doesn't go. Between 1930 and 35, she sets 7 women's speed and distance records, including autogyro records. 1935, she starts discussing the new prize. One flight, which I most wanted to attempt, a circumnavigation of the globe as near as its waistline as could be. Don't you remember we talked about a male aviator who had flown around the world, and he hadn't flown around effectively the equator. And what she wants to do is to fly around the world as close to the equator as she can. So she'll be the first woman, and it'll be the first really genuine circumnavigation of the world rather than cutting it across.
Yeah.
So in 36, she starts planning, not solo, but with a navigator. And actually, you could argue, well, you know, it's not as exciting if she's not solo. This is truly, truly difficult. She's flying 29,000 miles, an equatorial route. And what is it she's trying to do? She's trying to court publicity along the route to increase interest in a planned book about the expedition, which in turn is about demonstrating women's ability in the world. So I've got 2 quick more clips to play. And the reason why I want to play these is because this is our opportunity to actually hear Amelia in her own words. And there's a little bit of sort of other talk about it. So let's just listen to this first one, which was a newsreel about her round the world trip. And this is the preparation.
It's a real flying laboratory equipped with the latest of instruments. And I hope to accomplish something really worthwhile in aviation scientifically. I myself am particularly interested in the reaction of the human being to all aspects of flying. I hope the experiments will include altitude flying and also long-distance work.
How about taking me along?
Well, gasoline is really more valuable than you are on a long flight.
You mean that 180 pounds of gasoline you figure would be more useful than 180 pounds of husband?
You've guessed right.
So really, the fact that we could hear her talking about it, this is a really modern woman, understands narrative, understands publicity. And I was thinking about this because we've talked this with other influencers. Was she a tactician or a strategist? Gareth, what do you reckon? Because tactically, she gets in an aeroplane and she flies and she does one thing after another. Strategically, what do you reckon?
So yeah, I want to reserve judgment in that, you know, I'm going off
Limited
what is
information.
a very brief summary, but strikes me that she's a tactician more than a strategist. There's a pragmatism and a direct call to action throughout everything she does. And I get the impression that this is her doing what she wants to do. There is perhaps a wider purpose in mind in terms of improving the opportunities for other women through the actions that she takes, but I don't get the impression there is a deliberate strategy and that this was sort of long-term planning with, I will take this step and I'll take that step and that will get me to here. And it feels to me like she seizes opportunities when they're presented, and she pragmatically lives life based on what she wants to do at the time, which is opportunistic and tactical.
I mean, I think the answer is we don't know. I mean, this is always the challenge
Or
with some of these. Yeah, well, but this is a challenge with some of these influencers that you sort of have to invent the things between the gaps, what goes on in the gaps between. I don't know. I I'd be fascinating to know. But maybe the more important point is that some of the things that our most successful influence have is exactly what you say. They're able to take the tactical steps, but they understand their mission, they understand their goal, and each of these is designed to move them further along. Honestly, I think she was probably more strategic than we might think. It feels like these are building blocks. I just don't know that they're accidental. Anyway, we're now getting to the point of the round the world trip. She has a aircraft built specially for her, for the aircraft nerds around us. It's a Lockheed Electra. It's this beautiful silver aircraft, twin engine, really, really lovely thing. They're going west around from America and they have all sorts of challenges. There's an accident that damages the aircraft. The attempt is sort of briefly abandoned, but they decide to then change their mind and they go east. And on the 1st of June, they depart Miami. They go via South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and in 1930, well, June 29th in 1937, they arrive in New Guinea. So actually, they've done a big, long trip. That was a 45-day journey and not easy. They have to stop for repairs. Earhart gets dysentery. And then in Darwin, and starts to sort of touch upon a tragedy, parachutes are removed from the aircraft and the direction finder was repaired. I don't know why the parachutes removed. Bad thing. And likewise, the direction finder, there's a lesson here for all of us, never mind influencers, which is details matter. We'll come back to them in a second. The final leg where she goes missing was New Guinea to a place called Howland Island, which is pretty much due east of New Guinea. A trip of 2,223 miles, by far the longest leg. And just to give you a sense of that, transatlantic is 1,700 miles. This was significantly longer than transatlantic. Supposed to be a 20 hours flight, and they were aiming for an island. This is really bad. 6,500 feet long and 1,600 foot wide. Good game, good game. Like as a failed navigator in the Royal Navy, I can tell you flying over 2,000 miles and aiming to hit something 6,500 feet long and 1,600 feet wide, you do not want to necessarily do that. Now,
Yeah.
a US Coast Guard cutter was dispatched to the island to offer communications and direction finding. So it wasn't just dead reckoning. They were going to use the direction finding equipment to home in on the radio signal from the boat. There was also a dark column of smoke they were going to send up that you could see over the horizon. The point being, we are here. At 3 p.m. that day, Earhart reports her altitude is 10,000 feet. So there's communications along the way. At 5 o'clock, she reports 7,000 feet and a speed of 150 knots. At 6:14 a.m., a call is received saying she is within 200 miles of the island and is requesting the direction finding signal from the ship. At this point, the ship realizes it cannot tune into the aircraft or the other way around. In other words, the frequencies are wrong. At 6:45, a similar request is made saying they're only 100 miles away. And not only could they not connect to the ship, but Earhart cannot hear messages from the ship as well. At 7:58 a.m., Earhart says she could not hear the ship signals, but the ship reported her signal as being the loudest possible signal. So they know that they were in the area. Last voice transmission received on Howland Island indicates they were flying along a line of position north to south of the island and never arrives. So somewhere along the line, she crashed. There is a huge amount of conspiracy theories ranging from they landed in Japanese held territory and she was captured. Most people just conclude that she ran out of fuel and crashed in the ocean, which is Occam's razor suggests that.
It seems like the most likely thing, doesn't it?
I
wonder.
Tragic, but most likely.
Yeah, it is tragic. But I was just thinking, if we could, in an alternative universe, bring Amelia Earhart back and talk to her post this happening, I wonder whether she'd have changed any of her decisions, or whether this was a very, very known risk. and a risk she was willing to take. And of course, nobody wants to die in an air crash, but I get the impression she'd have rather died trying than not tried at all.
I would, I mean, it's a really interesting question, which, as with many of these kinds of things we've done before, we can't tell. I am almost certain she would have done it again. This is what she did. She knew the risks. It wasn't sort of like, well, we didn't really know how dangerous it was. She knew the risks. She would do it again, I'm sure. In the 70s, a retired US Navy captain, Lawrence Stafford, analyzed the flight in real detail. And he looked at all the radio transmissions, everything. And his conclusion simply was, Occam's razor, the flight was poorly planned and executed poorly. And that maybe is the tragedy, which is, yes, it was risky, but they made mistakes. This idea that the radio couldn't receive a transmission, that's something you can test.
Yeah.
The fact that the direction finding frequencies presumably were wrong, that could have been text. But never mind that, incredibly brave woman. And maybe if you're going to go, that's the way to go. So just to finish up on her legacy, she embraced celebrity culture and women's rights. And frankly, since her disappearance, and maybe her disappearance even continued this sort of the myth of her, global cultural icon, not just in the way she looked, how she behaved, the opportunities she brought. I always look around and try and find some interesting things. Lots of memorials have been made in her name. There was a 2012 tribute by the then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who said at a State Department event celebrating the ties of Earhart in the United States to its Pacific neighbors, that she created a legacy that resonates today for anyone, girls and boys who dream of the stars. She was widely known and an absolute international celebrity. And this is a quote from someone who wrote about her, but I think it sort of captures it beautifully. She had a shyly charismatic appeal. She was both shy but charismatic. Hopefully you heard a little bit of that in her voice. Independence, persistence, coolness under pressure, courage, goal-oriented.
Yeah.
This, with her disappearance, frankly, have driven her to a still well known in popular culture, although obviously that's diminishing over time, but still incredibly important. Hundreds of articles written about her. She is considered a feminist icon. I mean, I don't know feminist icons, but absolutely in the world of feminism, she is seen as a hero, given everything we've talked about and moving things forward. 1967, someone, just so you know, flew an equivalent Lockheed Electra to complete the round-the-world flight. And lots of people have done similar things to almost memorialize her. 1942, US Liberty ship was named after her. In 1964, Purdue University named a hall after her. There's a dam named after her, a tree named after her, and there is a stamp. I'm going to finish on this thought before we sort of do a roundup. I said earlier she was a seer, that she looked into the future. I read her book, The Fun of It, this 1932 book. And when I read this chapter, I nearly fell off my chair, because lots of people talk about the future and what they think will be true. And back in 1932, none of this was possible to predict, really. But I love that she got this so right. So here's what she predicted. First of all, she says, flying will become faster. Okay, not a hard one. But, quote, physicians seeing no reason why you couldn't fly at 700 plus miles per hour. Okay, we now fly regularly at 700 miles per hour. I'm flying, when am I flying next? I'm flying to Spain in a couple of weeks. I'll be doing that. Well done, she got that right. This, by the way, she flew at 84 miles per hour, if we remember earlier on. Yeah, I can predict 700 miles an hour. She predicted wings that retract at speed. For those of you familiar with aviation and as nerdy as me, the Tornado aircraft that the Royal Air Force used to fly and the German Navy used to fly, swing wing aircraft. This is all about at different speeds, you do different things with the wings. Rocket planes, she predicted, planes that travel in the stratosphere. Gigantic aircraft. I gave you a quote at the beginning about the first all-female crew in the US Air Force. That was flying the Galaxy, the C-141, which can take, I think off the top of my head, 4 Abrams tanks, huge aircraft. She predicted pilotless aircraft, radio beams to guide aircraft, round the world flights. And finally, quote, that women will share in these endeavors even more than they have in the past is my wish and prophecy. Well, Amelia, you did all right, because that is exactly what has happened today. And I look back to when I learned to fly, which is now many years ago, and in the crew room, there were just as many women learning to fly as there were men. And that
Yeah.
is what Amelia Earhart did.
Amazing. Yeah. I think really interesting the predictions at the end there, because that's slightly sort of different from everything else we've kind of been discussing in terms of her influence. But I think it alludes to the fact that people who are on the forefront of, driving change, doing new things, often have a really good insight into how these things will continue to develop and the trends that they're creating, which, in a very obscure way relates to some of the things we've talked about in the past in terms of future prediction, dealing with change, dealing with uncertainty. What an amazing woman.
Yeah, this was one of the ones where we've had lots of influence where you can really go look at how they did that. We can learn from that. I think this is one of those where it's less easy to pull those things out. There's echoes of those things, but nevertheless, I thought it was such a fantastic story, and maybe there are universal things we can pull out in terms of courage, mission, being genuine, just doing it, just getting on with it. And part of them, sort of the world parts in front of you as you get there. But if nothing else, I've been really pleased to tell a story that perhaps hasn't been told as much in recent years. And as we said at the very beginning, this is not about men or women. This is about great influencers and people who are able to shape the future world. Good on
Yeah.
Amelia Earhart. That's what I say.
No, absolutely. And I wonder if that it's not as easy to, draw those lessons is perhaps a result of somebody who was at the forefront of change, doing some amazing things, but actually the documentation of that, the narration of that, the brand, the narrative, the interest was overshadowed and obscured by the fact that she was a woman doing it. And
I
so,
think there's
you
an
know,
element of that.
very much like that clip we heard earlier, she gets off the plane having been the first woman to cross the Atlantic, and they make quips about her going shopping. Perhaps it's easier to talk about Churchill and Rommel because they have been documented as great influencers, as great leaders, and that this is more a reflection of society and society's ability to understand the influence than it is the influence that she had.
And I love the idea that somewhere in the world tomorrow, whether it be in Europe, Africa, Asia, America, some girl is going to do something that everyone goes, oh, you're not supposed to do that. And some boy does something when someone goes, you're not supposed to do that. And those are the next Amelia Earharts doing something that we'll talk about in 100 years. And it's not about being boys or girls. It's about merit. And Amelia, I think you showed merit. Okay, that's the end of this week's episode. The usual spiel ensues. We thank you for listening to Battling with Business. It's a weekly ritual where myself and Gareth look at downloads and the countries it comes from. So thank you for downloading this. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, because that way every Thursday you will get the episodes coming directly to your device. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, we've got some real crackers coming up for you. We will be visiting another, I'm going to tease it here, Gareth, another one of the British Armed Forces. We won't tell you which branch it is, but we're going to see them 2 weeks' time. So we'll be recording when we go see there. We have another very exciting recording coming up where we have an author of an excellent book. I will be talking about how excellent that book is, but that will be another one of our influencers. So we'll see. So please do subscribe. That way you'll get to see this. It'll come straight to you every week. Tell your friends. If this was an interesting or exciting story, tell them. If some of the ideas or concepts, whether it be in the influencers or our regular episodes, is interesting, please go tell people. We want to make this a growing community of people who are equally passionate about being better at being leaders and managers and everything in between. So please go ahead and do that. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us this week, and we will speak to you again soon on Battling with Business.
Wonderful. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.